Welcome to Staying Connected, a podcast where I talk to other people about their stories with VEDS or Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Staying Connected. This is your host, Katie, and before we get into the show, I want to remind you that the views, information, and opinions in these podcasts are those of the individuals involved and do not represent the opinions of the Marfan Foundation. The Marfan Foundation is not responsible for and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in them, nor does the information constitute medical or other professional advice or services. This show is not produced by or affiliated with the Marfan Foundation or the VEDS movement. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I just want to say I am so excited to welcome you to this season of Staying Connected. This season, we're going to talk to 7 people about their stories with VEDS and one of the physician researchers in our community about her involvement and what the VEDS community means to her. New episodes will be released every other Saturday until December 18th, when the final episode of this season will air. To kick off this season, we're going to talk to Mike DeCoursey, who lives in Dallas, Texas. He and his son were diagnosed with Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome in 2016. Before we go to the interview, I just want to thank you, Mike, for sharing your story with VEDS on the podcast and for everything you're doing to raise awareness for VEDS. So keep up the good work. I can't wait to see what you do in the future, and let's go ahead and go to the interview. Hey, Mike, I'm really excited to have you here to share your story with us today. And I would love it if you would introduce yourself to the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Mike DeCoursey. I'm 42 years old and I live here in Dallas, Texas.
And when were you diagnosed with VEDS?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed about 5 years ago in 2016. I was 37 years old at the time. And the reason we found out about this was mainly because of our first child, my son, who was maybe a few months at the time and had some issues as a baby. He had trouble swallowing and we need to put him on a feeding tube and just had a lot of issues. He kind of has hypotonia, which is low tone, a lot of issues that, now in hindsight, may not even be directly correlated to vascular EDS, but it ultimately caused us to get genetic testing. And this is where vascular EDS came up. And then, of course, they wanted to test Alex's parents. So I got tested, found out I had it. And our geneticist, kind of light bulbs went off in her head, knowing my family history and how my father had passed away of an aortic dissection when he was 49 in 1986. So kind of it all came together for us in 2016.
So how did that feel getting both the diagnosis for your son and for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot to take in at the time. And my wife at the time was pregnant with our second, and she was just weeks away from having our daughter Isla. And so we found out about all this and on top of the potential that Isla could have had it as well. And plus the fact that I had gone 30 plus years and doctors had always kind of told me, look, it was very unfortunate how your father passed, but, from what we can tell, it's not hereditary. And then to have it be correlated was kind of a big shock. So I still remember this day is actually my wife was given the information even before I was, and she was the one to kind of deliver the news to me. And, it was just hard to really absorb. And then within a week or two, I was kind of getting those full body scans that everyone, knows about. And then fast forward there, and we actually found out I had some aneurysms developing in my iliac artery. So it was a whirlwind, to say the least. And then, like you said, to just kind of have to deal with our son as well. And that whole aspect was a lot to take in, but at the same time, over the last 5 years, we've really realized how much knowing about this is advantageous and how powerful it can be, but it's scary to accept it and have to move on and live your life.
Yeah, it's a super scary thing. And I remember that whirlwind of emotions myself when I got my diagnosis. It was just it was so hard to process. There was just so much to
Sure.
process. And I can't imagine processing that while also processing the diagnosis of my child and expecting another one on the way. So I can imagine, or can't really imagine, because I don't have
Yeah.
children, but I really, that had to be hard.
And we ended up testing Isla. I mean, she was probably hours old.
Oh,
And the doctors did a blood test and sent it away. And within a few days, we found out she actually didn't have it. So there was some relief there. But even by that time, we were still processing what the heck this even was and learning about, vascular EDS. We were still very new to everything.
yeah. And then, so then a few weeks after your diagnosis, you got your first scan and then found out you had some aneurysms in your iliac artery.
Yeah, exactly. Both in my right and left. Fortunately, at the time, they weren't large enough to do anything about it. So it was kind of the maintenance monitoring
Mm-hmm.
game from that point forward. But in the beginning, they kind of did every 6 months, and within a couple years of doing that, they looked stable. So they were, I was always curious to know, like, all right, when did they start developing or how did they develop? And of course, you're not given those answers, and you kind of have to just forgive and forget that you're
Yeah.
not going to get those answers. But yeah, for the last 4 or 5 years, I was getting my scans, and they were barely growing. So everything looked stable, at least from that standpoint.
And so I noticed that you're talking about these in the past tense. So what happened with those?
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure why I'm doing that exactly. Well, fast forward to January of this year, and I don't know the phrasing people usually. I've been using the word event a lot, but I had my first true event or symptomatic event associated with vascular EDS, where out of the blue, one morning, I I just felt a kind of sharp, weird, unique pain in my kind of upper groin thigh area. And I was literally, it was probably just, 10 feet behind me from where I'm sitting talking to you right now, literally just trying to pick out what shirt I was going to wear that morning. So I wasn't doing anything strenuous, nothing physical, literally just standing there. And it just kind of hit me out of nowhere. And it was painful, but it wasn't like the worst pain I had in the world. But what really kind of alarmed me within minutes of feeling that pain was I felt numbness kind of just circulating throughout my entire leg all the way down to my foot.
Mhm.
Um, and so within a couple minutes, and luckily, we have a great relationship with our doctors, and I had been able to get in touch with him within 5 minutes, and he said to go to the ER right away. I probably would have gone anyway. And this just goes back to how helpful it is knowing I have this, because I sometimes go there, right, to think that many people in my position have that incident without the serendipitous nature of having a genetic condition 5 years ago to inform you that you have this condition. And sometimes they find out they have this condition with the event, and how scary that could be. I mean, it's scary no matter what, but I think knowing I had it, and especially I have to thank my wife for always taking this very seriously and having, a bag packed and like a protocol and our team ready, and like just having all those, I's dotted and T's crossed. We were off to the hospital within minutes, and it made all the difference, because what was going on physically was essentially I had a 3.5 inch dissection of my iliac artery leading down to my femoral artery. So it's essentially mimicking, at least what they told me. I'm obviously not a doctor, but what they told me was that it kind of emulated a blood clot to some extent, and the blood wasn't getting down to the rest of the leg. And by the time I got to the hospital, they were getting no pulses in the foot, very low pulses in the rest of the leg, and they had to bring me in for surgery right away.
And how did that go? Did that all go smoothly?
It did. It was a whirlwind experience, but luckily they did exactly what they needed to do. Three stents later. The funny thing is, it really didn't even stem from the original aneurysm that was developing on my right side. So while they were in there anyway, they ended up putting a stent in that aneurysm since they were on the right side, and then two more to kind of correct basically the tunnel, so to speak, that had the dissection leading down to my femoral artery. So the surgery, I mean, I have a care team out of Houston and I'm in Dallas, and they coordinated great together. There was some talk of me being brought out to Houston for the surgery, but time was of the essence, because they started talking about, within hours, I could have started losing the possibility of my foot or my leg without the circulation and blood flow. Wow. Which is just so surreal to even hear myself talking about, because again, I take myself back to that morning, and within minutes before it happening, I remember I was like playing with my 4-year-old daughter, and we were having so much fun, and I felt fine. I was feeling good physically, and then boom, this happens. It's scary how out of nowhere it can be.
Yeah. So how did you kind of cope with that surrealness coming out of that situation and now coming into life, but having lived through that? Like, what did that feel like?
Yeah, it's I mean, it was life-changing for me. It just kind of reframed kind of my whole perspective on life, honestly, mostly for the better, which is the positive out of it. But I mean, I remember joking with people within the first few weeks of getting out of the hospital, because I physically, and even still to this day, I'm now 5+ months from surgery, and so my recovery has been, in the last couple of months, I've made a lot of great strides, but ironically, the recovery has been mostly due to just the fact that my blood wasn't getting that blood flow and circulation. So we think at this point there was some muscle and nerve damage done, not really associated with VEDS, just from the fact of having the lack of blood flow in parts of my leg. Doctors are optimistic that maybe it's not complete long term, but we're still kind of assessing that. And they said it could take 6 to 12 months to feel completely normal again. But I'm optimistic based on the last couple months, like, because the first few months I was still limping and going through it. And the reason I'm harping on the whole physical aspect was, as challenging as that was, it was really the mental recovery that was, or is still, it's not like it's over, but that mental recovery is the harder part coming out of something like that. And I feel like I did a pretty decent job turning to a lot of the support. Like I started going to the VEDS support group right after that. And in hindsight, I wish I had gone earlier, but I'm glad I took advantage of it when I did, and just to kind of be around people that really knew or went through a lot of similar things that I had just gone through, really helped me, feel like I was not alone during that time. But the mental recovery is an ongoing process, and one that's you're never really kind of done with. You're kind of always working on with VEDS.
Yeah, I agree. It's never even with just the diagnosis itself, like that feeling never fully goes away. It's just it just becomes a little different, or you deal with it a little bit differently.
Exactly.
So now you're doing something else this year too, for like getting back into activity and things and raising awareness. I think coming off of that would be a great time for you to talk about that.
Yeah, and it's what I alluded to before about, kind of reframing and reshaping my whole perspective, and really, not just the fact that I have it again, something my son has and is going to have to, live his life with. I really, obviously, for many reasons, not just VEDS itself, but of course, I want to be a role model for him, but also for others in this community. I feel like I can bring a lot to the table to people who need it, and use this opportunity. My whole mantra in this recovery has been crisis equals opportunity. and really figuring out how I can take this negative and turn it into a positive and really help make an impact in this community. And so I kind of decided to embark on this whole, journey where I was going to make it somewhat physically related. But of course, ultimately, what I wanted to do was raise funds and awareness for vascular EDS. So I've created a website and this whole mission. It's called Walk with Deco. Deco is my nickname. And, I obviously didn't want to do anything too strenuous, like coming out of recovery and things like that. So I'm trying to walk 4 million steps to raise $40,000 for vascular EDS by the end of the year. And I'm about 1 month into it, and things are going great. And it's just amazing to see the outpouring of support behind the mission. And it just feels good to be able to play a small role in the efforts and community to bring a lot of awareness to vascular EDS, which is, and obviously have a lot of those funds directed towards research, which is needed in so many ways.
Yeah. So where do people find more information about that?
Yeah, so I created a website, walkwithdeco.com, and you can find all the information there. I've also decided to, keep people engaged in my journey. I decided to also do a podcast along with it. So you can find the Walk with Deco podcast on Apple and other streaming podcast platforms. It's been an interesting ride because what I'm doing is I'm actually doing the podcast while I'm out on my walks and getting my steps in to just kind of bring people in on that journey a little bit. And honestly, the topics I talk about are kind of whatever's kind of hitting me that day and what's inspiring me and what's on my mind. And a lot of it is all through the lens of vascular EDS. And definitely in my first few episodes, I talk a lot about that, but I also go into other topics that in some way are closely related to VEDS, but not really, just kind of everyday life struggles that we all go through.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that you do this while you're out on your walk too. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's provided for some interesting audio challenges, but I keep joking that hopefully it's all about the appeal and experience. But if you're expecting like a really great audio experience without any background noise, then maybe this podcast isn't for you. But you get birds chirping, you get cars flying by, planes flying overhead. It shows that I'm outside and getting my steps in.
Yeah, that sounds really nice. So thank you for sharing that information. I
Sure.
do want to go back to your diagnosis and any outward features that you have that maybe you were missed when you were a kid. Do you have any, or did you have any?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, nothing that I can specifically. I mean, I sometimes see other people in the VEDS community, and I can see maybe some facial features, whether it be the nose or like they say, I think it's thin lips, or I wouldn't say anything because not to get too, of course, medical, but we have the null mutation, which we were always told that like is one of the most, I guess, benign types, but at the same time saying that, based on what happened to my father and, the fact that I had an event in my early 40s, it obviously doesn't mean, we're immune to events happening. Having said that, what I failed to mention earlier is when I found out about the diagnosis, my wife did a great job of really kind of uncovering some other people in our family tree where they either must have had it, they died pretty early from a kind of unexplained event, or even, my two sisters found out, older sisters have it, but have never had an event, have gotten scans and don't have any aneurysms developing or anything like that. So we're thankful for that, of course. But, the other thing growing up, if I had to scrutinize and nitpick, is definitely the easy bruising I probably had growing up. Not knowing, it's always been a blessing and a curse. Like I look back on my childhood and, in some ways I'm thankful that I didn't know about this diagnosis because I lived a carefree childhood and played sports and roughhoused like the best of them. But then again, maybe what I'm hopeful for my son, obviously, in the early intervention, with medications, and he's on a beta blocker just like I am. Early scans, we actually just last week he's 6 years old now, and he got his second set of scans, and they all went great, but it's a stressful experience for mom and dad to, especially as they're that young, they get put under for the scans because it could take a couple hours to do everything. And so, yeah, and even my son, like he maybe has a little bit of that easy, bruising, but nothing too obvious, honestly, in our family history that we can really pinpoint to.
Yeah. And that's important too, because there's so many people out there who I meet that don't have very many outward signs at all. It's either usually those people that I talk to, it's the easy bruising and the sleeping with the eyes open sometimes. A lot of people do that too. But there are people out there who don't have any signs at all, really, and they still have it. And it's important to recognize.
Yeah, we have a little bit of the sleeping with the eyes open just slightly. Yeah, and again, how often is that going to come up? Like who's analyzing your face when you're sleeping growing up?
Yeah, really just your parents.
Right.
Or your friends. I remember when I was a kid, my friends said, you're not really sleeping right now. We know you're faking it because you sleep with your eyes kind of open and they're closed right now. But yeah, it's definitely good to share because there's so many people out there who just don't have anything.
Right.
For sure. So if there was a piece of advice, you're a few years into your diagnosis now, that you would give somebody who's newly diagnosed or just kind of like grappling with thinking they have it, or, they're just struggling, what piece of advice would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been lucky. I've had the support of my wife, who's been just tremendous throughout all this and been so super organized with, really getting the care team together. That's one thing I would certainly recommend. But at the same time, I would hate to overwhelm someone and say, like, on day one, you have to like get all these, things in line, because it can be kind of overwhelming to just take in. But once you kind of digest it a little bit, I do now harp on the fact that don't be afraid to know that you have this. Knowing this is such a leg up in terms of getting the care you need if something were to happen, and having your care team in place. There's a level of anxiety that is accounted for, and kind of, even heading to the hospital when I had my events, just knowing all those pieces were in place was so reassuring, as scary as it still was. So I think, just getting that care team in place and just going out for support. I mean, I know there are a lot of great support groups out there, but knowing the right ones to go to, I definitely recommend against, playing Google Doctor and just like, searching things with vascular EDS, because it can lead you down to paths that, maybe is not exactly tied to your situation, or, look, it is scary. There's no sugarcoating that, but I think, and I'm not trying to throw stones. I've done it too before, in terms of like Googling things, and then in the beginning, and it didn't lead anywhere good. So you really have to scrutinize the sources you go to, whether it be medical journals or articles, or just the support groups themselves. But don't be afraid to reach out for the support. I mean, it is a rare condition. And so whenever you can feel not alone, and really kind of commiserate with people, I like going to it, because there's some weeks where I feel ready to support others, and there's some weeks where I feel like I need the support. And it's great to know you can kind of play both of those roles. But yeah, I guess the one thing I would harp on is try to, coach someone through the fact that it's a blessing that you have knowledge of this, as tough as it is to live with that knowledge. Mm-hmm. It can lead to events where you can take care of it and be okay. So that would be the one thing I would kind of harp on.
Yeah. And what you said just triggered something for me too. This idea, like, that knowing about it can really help you when you're having an event. So if there's something, I know that this is something that really comes up a lot for emergency situations with VEDS. And so not particularly for emergency professionals, but any medical professional, if they're was a medical professional listening to this podcast, what would you tell them about what it's like living with VEDS, or what would you want them to know?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come right to mind. What I feel like medical professionals need to know is that sometimes we come in with life-threatening situations that are not outwardly obvious. It could be we are young and look healthy and are not taken as seriously, or aren't bleeding, or some physical thing. Like, even in my case, it was so serious, but like I said before, it wasn't even the worst pain I had. But knowing I had VEDS, and knowing it's a struggle, right? Because my wife and I know it's always going to be a kind of for lack of a better word, a fight, kind of getting through the emergency room. Mm-hmm. But again, that like making those relationships with your care team, and maybe even doing a dry run, or knowing what obviously hospital you're going to go with, and introducing yourself to the ER staff. Like, there are all those things that you can do, not to just put your mind at ease, but also to prep, any potential emergency staff that might need to know about that, because that paid huge dividends for me, knowing exactly where we were going in that event, knowing exactly what doctor was going to operate on me, and fortunately, I know it can be scary, because unfortunately it could happen anywhere where you might not have that access. But, luckily for me, it happened at home, and we just kicked our, plan into place. So I think that's the one thing medical professionals just need to know about and learn, is to be taken seriously, so that you can get your scans right away and they can confirm or not whether there's something serious going on. The other thing with medical professionals that I'd personally love for them to know about, and I've alluded to it earlier on in the conversation, you get your diagnosis, and some geneticists and things are pretty good about this, but it's certainly not across the board, is that, again, it becomes about learning about the physical component of this condition. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the whole mental aspect of where you go from there and how you deal with that, I don't feel like those are openly encouraged or readily available for people who really need that, especially in the weeks or months leading after a diagnosis. So I would certainly love to see progress in some ways, where the doctors kind of align better with the medical, with the mental side of medicine, to really attack this diagnosis in both ways, not just the physical, like you have to get your scans, we have to, like, all that's great, but the patient themselves are not really being cared for from a mental perspective, and how to deal with a rare condition, that especially this, where things can happen out of nowhere, and you need to be ready for it. So those are some things that come to mind when I would like medical professionals to know about.
Yeah. And I think that you've touched on this a couple of times, that mental health aspect, and, caring for your mental health, but also connecting with others and those support groups, and how helpful that could be too. And I just love that you're giving that advice to medical professionals too, because it is, I've talked to so many people who get their diagnosis and they're told, oh, go home and prepare your will. And, and it's all the support that they get, and that's not enough. And that does a lot to your brain. It's just a lot to go through. This diagnosis is a lot to go through. And if you're on the other end of this podcast and you're listening to it and you're struggling, there are resources out here to help you. And I'll put a link to them in the description of this episode in
That's
the show
awesome.
notes. But
yeah. I mean, because I've been on support groups. I've said the words myself. I'm sure many have. My whole thing has always been saying, like, sometimes I feel like a ticking time bomb's like inside me. And some people have said, like, it's like they feel like a sniper. They're just waiting for the next shoe to drop, or like, you could have indigestion or something, a cramp, and like, was that something? Was that? And like, you're kind of always overanalyzing just the littlest, most subtlest things of everyday life that could weigh on anyone. Mm-hmm. And so, how to deal with that, how to process those things, and learn to live with it, is not easy to do. So yeah, I mean, having those resources available on how to work through those things are so important to someone right after diagnosis.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your story with me and with other people. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening in today, and a huge thanks again to Mike for sharing his story on the podcast. I hope you all enjoy this show, and I hope you find it informative or helpful. This podcast and all of you are so close to my heart, and it would mean so much to me if you shared the show far and wide to help us raise awareness of VEDS together. Thank you so much. Be sure to subscribe to the show and stay tuned for the next episode on September 25th. We will be talking to Lindell Frazier in Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks so much again, and I will see you soon.